G'day ladies and gents, Cubic Meter here. Ever since I started designing redstone weapons, one of the most heavily requested ideas is an anti-air cannon. And normally I would simply say no, that's impossible. That is until school posted this video demonstrating how wind charges can encode the player's view angle. And then we made a video about an orbital rail cannon demonstrating its usage in player aimable cannons. The orbital rail cannon was a great proof of concept for the technology, but I designed it in version 1.21.4. In 1.21.5, literally the next subversion, there were two changes that completely broke this design. Bubble columns change in how much they accelerate entities, and arrows would no longer hold their random offsets when released from a fence gate. Even with a simple fix for the first issue, this last change is what fundamentally kills the design. Without the random spread, the rail cannon aims at a single point, which means it's very unlikely to hit anything. What we need is a completely new cannon concept, one that will contest the skies and force players to think twice before equipping their elytra. This is going to be a monumental challenge. A player with an elytra moves very fast. Powered by rockets, an elytra has a nominal cruising speed of 120 km per hour or 75 miles per hour. Of course, a player can hit much higher speeds by diving, however this is not sustainable and forces the player towards the ground instead of in the direction of travel. To make things even more difficult, the player's hitbox shrinks when they go into elytra mode, making them a very small fast-moving target. This makes flight arguably the most powerful superpower. With added mobility, you gain the ability to pick your fights and position yourself at an advantage to your opponents. A chestplate can absorb significantly more damage, but being restricted to moving slowly on the ground makes you susceptible to being targeted by heavier hitting sources of damage. This makes the elytra perhaps the most powerful piece of equipment the player can have. There is literally no weapon that can reliably counter a player once they are airborne. That is, unless we can have a say about it. I mean, we do have the technology, but currently that technology is quite terrible at hitting a fast, small moving target. The orbital rail cannon is just too slow. It takes about 4 seconds to fire a single shot, in which time a player could have flown over 100 meters from their original position. So what we need is accuracy and repeatability to give us as many chances as possible to hit a moving target, which means we need a machine gun. To start with, we need to think critically about which projectile to use, and for me, the answer is very clear, but it's important to understand why. The firework rocket might seem like the obvious choice because they have an area of effect, meaning they cover a broader area. However, the reality is they don't deal that much damage to a hardened target, and on top of that, they still need to impact the target directly to stand a chance of causing the explosion within range of the target. TNT suffers even more from this problem as the distance to its explosion is fixed to the fuse time, which is very difficult to control when you're shooting at a fast moving target at an unknown distance. Arrows are the ideal projectile, as their damage output scales with their velocity, which means it's quite easy to accelerate an arrow to whatever speed is necessary to destroy an armored player. So only a single shot on target is needed to guarantee the kill. To provide the acceleration, we use TNT, which is steered by a wind charge into a direction encoding the player's view angle. This process was explained in detail in the video about the orbital rail cannon, so I strongly suggest to catch up with that video if you want to know the full dynamics of the aiming system. To generate the TNT, we use TNT dupers. The reason for this is logistics. To craft TNT, you need 5 gunpowder and 4 sand. If you play on a server where TNT duping is not allowed, then duping sand is probably also out of the question. A dispenser at full speed cranks out 300 TNT per minute. Assuming we need about 24 TNT to kill a player without a chestplate, plus an additional 20 TNT for the aiming mechanism, it would cost 14,000 sand to fire this hypothetical gun
for 12 seconds.
And the average player can mine sand at about 10 to 12 blocks per second, which means those 12 seconds of firing a hypothetical machine gun would cost you about half an hour of digging for sand. Without TNT duping, the logistics of operating our machine gun put too much of a strain on the player. And besides, what kind of servers disable TNT duping? That's right. Fundamentally, if you are playing on a paper server, none of these dynamics are guaranteed to work anyway. This is especially the case if you play on Minecraft Bedrock Edition. Though I guess Bedrock players can fly safe knowing they can't die suddenly from being shot out of the sky by an arrow machine gun. So we're using TNT dupers, but now we have a problem. The TNT starts in this shape, but we want it in a different shape. What we need is a mechanism known as a TNT compressor. And here is a TNT compressor for the Orbital Strike Cannon Mark 6. As you can see, they have a very fast repeating cycle, perfect for our machine gun. In fact, they put out 200 cycles per minute, which is the maximum speed you can realistically get from any mechanism involving entities and pistons. This is because our piston-based mechanisms take free game tick to push blocks in one direction and free game ticks to push them back again, meaning we are limited to one cycle every 6 game ticks. This TNT compressor is a great place to start, but it's not ideal for our anti-air gun. This is because it relies on gravity to keep the batches of TNT separated as we burn down the fuse times. But our gun will inevitably have to shoot up from the location of the TNT explosions, meaning the layout of the TNT compressor actually blocks part of our field of view. So we need to figure out a way to flip this compressor around so all the hardware can be neatly hidden underground and out of the way. The best way to reliably beat gravity is using bubble columns, and keeping the TNT moving is important, so we can give it time to coalesce whilst keeping the different cycles separated. This enables us to continuously compress multiple batches in parallel to maintain our high rate of fire. Just like with the orbital rail cannon, we offset the fuse times of 2 batches of TNT so that one can push the other through the aiming mechanism and into a blast chamber where our arrows will be fired from. If we go ahead and tick freeze and step a bit, we can find that for a single tick, our TNT will actually appear at the location where we can apply the knockback from the wind charge to encode the player's view angle. We can use get data commands to print the exact positions of each TNT at each step, to find the position of the mid-flight and explosion. These positions will be important for fine-tuning our aiming mechanism. We can control these positions using the relative alignments of our TNT as they drift up the bubble column. Through experimentation, I managed to find an alignment that gives a mid-journey position that is slightly behind the intersection between 4 blocks. This is because we'll need to use trapdoors which are open as the TNT enters, and then close to provide a base plane for the wind charge to collide with. By ensuring that the TNT is inside of the hitbox of the trapdoors when they close, the TNT can now no-clip through the trapdoors, like so. This ensures that we get to maximize the area we can use for aiming with the wind charges. Another neat quirk about this alignment is that the final position of our TNT just happens to be almost exactly in the middle of the intersection of 4 blocks, which means our aiming mechanism can be perfectly axis aligned to where the player is standing. So now we have the precise entity positions, we need to build mechanisms to align our wind charges and our arrows. This is where things will become very challenging. We want our aiming mechanism to be as accurate as possible, but the range of hitboxes available to us through Minecraft do not offer enough precision to obtain these arbitrary alignments. This is why in a previous video we explored how boats and minecarts can be given any arbitrary position through binary processes. Let's say I have an entity like a wind charge. I want to affect its position so it's at some very specific value, but I can only use the external sides of its hitbox as a reference surface. The neat thing about boats is that they are entities with a solid hitbox, meaning they have a solid reference surface that we can use to align other entities. A wind charge's hitbox is 0.3125 blocks wide, and a boat's hitbox is 1.375 blocks wide. So with known hitbox dimensions, You can easily align any entity to any arbitrary position by simply taking the desired position of the entity, adding half the width of the entity's hitbox, and half the width of a boat's hitbox, and that lands you on the position of the boat. Note that we only care about the exact position of the boat in relation to Minecraft's unit system, so we only require its position in the range 0 to 1. From this decimal, we can obtain our movement sequence through converting to a binary decimal and reading the sequence backwards, just like I demonstrated in the Precision Minecarts video. The alignment can then be replicated through an automated process using this machine. I even went as far as coding a Scarpet script that allows you to specify an alignment and generate the item sets needed to encode the machine. So if I go ahead and place down these chests, start the clock, just like that, we can tell the machine to align a minecart to any position we want. In theory, the alignment process seems pretty straightforward, but in practice there are a lot of complex mechanics involved. This is the mechanism that generates our stationary wind charges and propels them upwards. We use two wind charge generators in tandem because on their own they aren't actually fast enough to keep up with the 6 game tick throughput of our machine gun. While the wind charge is floating upwards, we need to adjust its position so it's in line with this TNT. One way to align entities is by simply slamming them into hitboxes. However, this doesn't work with projectiles such as wind charges which explode on impact. The other option is to use pistons. This works pretty well in most cases but has some unusual quirks. This is because along with the front face of the piston head pushing entities, the rear face of the piston head can also pull entities. One way to get around this issue is to move the entity using a block instead of the piston head. To start with our wind charge alignment, we need to ensure that every wind charge streaming out of the aligner has the same starting alignment. From our starting alignment, we need to work on shifting the position over to be in line with the TNT. The first alignment will use this boat with an alignment of about 0.166 to bring our wind charges in line with the TNT in the X direction. For the Z alignment, we have our boat aligned to about 0.269, which brings our wind charge in line with the TNT in the Z axis. We can then verify the precision of our alignment if we disable Entity No Explosion Influence, grab the initial position of the TNT, and then knock it upwards with a wind charge. And assuming our alignment was perfectly in the center, the new position of the TNT will not have shifted in the X or the Z. So the X position didn't change. Yeah, the Z position is precise to within 7 decimal places, which is definitely precise enough for what we need. Here's another neat quirk about wind charges. Because they are projectiles, their motion collisions are treated as point-like, whilst the piston-based collisions use the hitbox. This means we can squeeze the wind charges through really tight gaps to ensure they can never backtrack through the alignment mechanism and mess up our boat cart alignments. Also note that wind charges will not influence each other through their explosions. In fact, wind charges are not affected by any explosions. In my original video about experimenting with wind charges, we talked about the concept of swing, where explosive entities would jostle each other around through their explosion effects. Between 1.21.3 and 1.21.4, there was a bug introduced which makes it so wind charges do not respond to explosion knockback. This may be a bit of a hot take, but I think I like this behavior. In Canon Tech, you want explosions to occur at very precise locations. If the entities making those explosions apply knockback to each other, then what you get is utter chaos. TNT already suffers from this issue, so this new possibly unintended behavior actually means wind charges are even more useful in Canon Tech as precision explosion generators that can operate in really tight spaces. And quite frankly, if it were the case that these wind charges influence each other, I just don't see a machine gun like this being possible, so I really hope this behavior isn't going to be reverted. Let me know what you think about this behavior down in the comment section. For the next step, aligning the arrows comes with its own unique challenges. Arrows are affected by explosions, and because we are firing arrows so quickly, the arrows from the next cycle will be in range of the explosions from the previous cycle. We effectively need an explosion-proof blast chamber to launch the arrows. Adding water to eliminate the explosion damage will cause the arrows to slow down and lose a significant amount of speed when we fire them. But fortunately, arrows are projectiles, meaning they will have point-like collisions when moving. So even though their hitbox appears quite large, you can squeeze the arrows through tiny gaps between blast-resistant blocks. And by moving the arrows quickly, we can also ensure that only a single arrow is in range of the explosions every cycle, launching them through this trapdoor that closes when the TNT explodes. For aligning the arrows, we only need a wall pushed by a piston for the X direction. But for the Z, a boat is needed to accommodate the final displacement of our accelerating TNT. You can tell that the alignment is good because the arrows get launched straight upwards from the TNT's explosion origin. So now, all that is needed to steer the arrows is to steer the TNT using the wind charges. And here is where we get to the most time-consuming aspect of this project. We need a projectile from the player to hit the wind charge and get it moving in the direction of the player's view angle. But with our machine gun firing at such a fast rate, these projectiles would be consumed very quickly. The orbital row cannon uses snowballs to activate the wind charge that get consumed with every shot. An older prototype of the machine gun would do something similar, except it would have a snowball magazine. Essentially, you would need to load this with hundreds of snowballs that would float around in bubble columns until you would need to fire the gun. Needless to say, this solution is rather frustrating because it means the snowballs become the bottleneck for continuous firing, limiting you to about 200 shots. In comparison, our other consumables can be put into storage containers, allowing us to store thousands of shots. What we need is a solution to activate the wind charge without consuming additional projectiles. And after experimenting with several elaborate mechanisms for recovering arrows after triggering wind charges, I eventually stumbled across the perfect solution. Let's go ahead and chuck an arrow into this trapdoor. Notice how when I open the trapdoor, it seems like the arrow gets unstuck and starts moving for a split second. Well, what happens if we stick a wind charge close to the arrow and then open the trapdoor? Nothing happens. If I go ahead and pick up the arrow, and then shoot it again into the trapdoor, that time the arrow hit the wind charge. But if the arrow is already in the trapdoor, and I spawn the wind charge, it does nothing. I tried making all sorts of elaborate mechanisms, zero-ticking the trapdoor into the wind charge so that the arrow could then hit the wind charge through the trapdoor, but it was just seemingly impossible to get these mechanisms to work at the full 6 game tick firing speed. That is until I came across the magic number. It turns out there is a very specific range of offsets from the trapdoor where the wind charge would be activated from simply opening the trapdoor. I'm gonna be honest, it was kind of embarrassing how long it took for me to stumble across this. I had absolutely no idea how simple this mechanism could be. This really was one of those moments where this project went from being completely impossible to completely viable. Like, look at this mechanism. It's got like a single moving part that does everything I need to activate the wind charge. It's nuts. And the best part is that we already had the trapdoors incorporated into the aiming mechanism to provide the collision plane for the wind charges. These trapdoors are basically a mechanical engineer's wet dream, a single mechanism which solves so many problems. They act as a collision plane for the wind charges, a barrier to prevent the wind charges from affecting the arrow, a stasis chamber to prevent the arrow from despawning, and the activation mechanism for the wind charges, all in a single redstone component. And would you look at that, our aiming mechanism is already showing signs that it's working properly. Unfortunately, there is one caveat with this aiming mechanism. Our magic alignment for the wind charge locks us into a configuration that is not ideal for maintaining accuracy. If we look at a model of our system, the ideal alignment is one where the wind charge is as close as possible to the base plane, and the TNT is exactly 0.25 blocks below the wind charge's starting position. This results in a very wide field of fire that can shoot at extremely low angles, make it potentially usable against ground targets. Our magic alignment, on the other hand, requires the wind charge to have some distance from the base plane to be triggered by the arrow, meaning our field of fire becomes limited to higher angles and thus cannot be used against ground targets. However, this isn't too bad of a trade-off for the simplicity of this mechanism. To get a feel for how effective this aiming mechanism is, I've rigged the cannon with scripts and commands to measure the resulting arrow velocity for a range of firing angles. The result of this analysis shows that there is a small deviation in pitch which starts small at vertical angles and grows larger as you aim towards the horizon. The yaw angle, on the other hand, has a negligible deviation by comparison. If we adjust the deviation scale, we will see the tiny deviations trace out an almost perfect match between the input and output yaw. Here is all the data points plotted against a sphere. This gives us a strong indication that the aiming mechanism is continuous through every possible firing angle in a 360 around the player. The field of fire appears very spherical, which is great, but if you zoom in really closely on an area, you start to see that the points will be slightly delaminated from the surface of a perfect sphere. If you're wondering about the square hole at the top, this is the imprint of the firing platform where the player will stand. Meaning we trade a small portion of our field of fire to put the player in a safe position where their view angle is in line with the gun's origin. This turns out to be a good compromise as it makes aiming the cannon much simpler. But here is where we get to an annoying problem. You see, our arrows are travelling at a really high speed, about 27 blocks per tick. So each tick our arrows will travel about 27 blocks in the direction we are aiming. You would think that Minecraft would simply take the starting position of the arrow, take the motion of the arrow, then render it at some position between the end and starting position each frame. But it turns out that hidden inside Minecraft's networking code is this really stupid function that clamps the motion values to 3.9 before sending them to the client. So what the server sees is an arrow moving at 27 blocks per tick in some direction, but what my client sees is an arrow moving much slower in a completely different direction. Unfortunately, this makes aiming our gun a very jarring experience. I've already reported the bug if you want to know more about the issue, but for now, we have mods that can help. Implemented through TIS Carp editions is a feature called Entity Tracker Interval that allows you to increase the speed that your client receives updates from the server, so you can actually see the position of the entity each tick. However, this isn't a perfect solution, as the arrow will continue to derp between each tick. This mod that adds the green hitbox to the actual server position of the entity works pretty well, however it's only for single player worlds, so probably not the best solution. Velizar, being the absolute mad lad that he is, actually made a hotfix for the bug in a 1.21.6 build of tech utils, which I used in Face the Skies to make the arrows not derp around. However, this patch isn't rigorously tested and may prove problematic for people, so if merging doesn't jump on this bug quickly, you may see a patch implemented through mods, and I'll keep you guys posted. So how effective is our machine gun against players? We already got a taste through the cinematic edit, which took a lot of scripting and automation to produce. For example, I made a script which allows carpet bots to auto-aim at players, taking into account their position, motion, and even the pitch deviation data we analysed earlier to make an optimal prediction of where to aim. Let's say I'm your average player flying from point A to point B. I'm unlikely to anticipate being shot at by a supersonic arrow, so I'm just flying in a straight line. Oh, yep. And that is instant death. But now I've just been randomly shot out of the sky. I know it was from an arrow, so likely the next time I approach, I'm going to be moving a bit less predictably. And as you can see, it's actually quite effective. Oh, yeah, that wasn't a good idea. Yeah, don't fly into the explosion vortex in the middle of the cannon. But yep. I can definitely reach the cannon and I can switch it off. This is a common problem with any anti-air weapon. You just can't predict with absolute certainty where the target will be by the time the payload hits. However, you can't deny that this gun still provides the absolute best chance that you could possibly have to take down a flying player. And the rest of the problem is up to you, the player, to use your ability to aim and predict where your opponents will be when the arrows hit. So I guess the problem of how effective this cannon can actually be is literally a skill issue. And possibly an issue with Minecraft's poorly implemented networking code. What's that? You want to build this, but you don't want to use Litematica? In all seriousness though, you're going to have a very bad time trying to replicate this design without a schematic. And this particular design is a bit trickier than your average technical build, because it includes those precise boat card alignments. In my video about the Orbital Strike Cannon Mark 6, I've already demonstrated a bunch of tools and features from Litematica that you can use to customize my designs. For example, the Edit Schematic feature allows you to substitute the blocks in the schematic with a block palette of your choosing. All this stone is filler blocks and can be literally anything including air. This grass can be any block matching the surface of your world, white stained glass must at least be a full cube, white concrete must be solid and movable, moss has to be non-sticky, and the cobblestone in the blast chamber can be any material with a blast resistance of 6 or more. Once you're happy with your changes, you can save the placement as a new schematic and use that to gather materials for your build. It's extremely important to note that this design is highly directional and cannot be rotated under any circumstances. Apart from that, you can position this gun pretty much anywhere. I would suggest building the schematic layer by layer, as you will eventually encounter these points where you'll need to add the precision aligned boat carts. Go into the schematic subregions, enable the boat cart aligners. These machines will take the sequence of unstackable and stackable items in these chests as the means of automating our precision alignments. To verify the contents of these chests and make sure that they are accurate, you want to render the schematic and hold down the I key to show you a preview of what the chest contents should look like. Getting the boats into the minecart is a very straightforward process, and you want to make sure that once this is done, that you properly reposition the minecart so that it's perfectly centered on the starting rail. Once the aligner is ready with the correct encoding sequence, you can start the aligner by turning off this lever, which will start the automated aligning process. Once the aligning is done, you want to make absolutely sure that you do not nudge the minecart from this point onwards. To get it into position, you can simply break the blocks supporting it, and it will drop into position in the correct layer of the schematic. To encase the block cart in the blocks indicated in the schematic, simply place them one block higher and then push them into position using pistons. Now your boat cart is in position and you can get on with building the rest of the schematic. To actually use the cannon, you'll need to shoot an arrow in between these trapdoors. This causes the cannon to only respond to the player's view angle who shot the arrow. To prevent the arrow from despawning, you can disable this lever to activate a clock which constantly refreshes the arrow's despawn timer. Inside the cannon, there are two storage locations for our consumables. These chests will store the wind charges, and this chest down here stores the arrows. With these storages completely full, you have about 4,000 shots for just over 20 minutes of continuous firing. You can use any type of arrow depending on the supplies available to you. The only reason I use spectral arrows is so I can target them separately with commands for testing. Once you've set up your cannon and verified that everything's in the right place, you have two options for starting the cannon. Either you can press this button, or you can get yourself into position and use a bow to activate the cannon from the vantage point provided. Once the cannon is active, it will start firing arrows roughly in the direction that you're aiming. To increase visibility, you can activate hitboxes, and to switch the cannon off again, simply fire at the target block to toggle the cannon off, and the cannon will immediately stop firing arrows, and it will stop the TNT aligners, and then the cannon will return to being idle. It's important to note that this cannon is handling lots of entities at any given time, meaning it will have a noticeable impact on your game's performance. Another problem is that arrows shot outside of render distance will become frozen in unloaded chunks until a player visits those chunks and loads in hundreds of arrows which suddenly start raining from the sky. There isn't really much we can do about this, and the arrows will eventually despawn once they've hit the ground. For those of you willing to try out the gun or practice using it against players, I built this test scenario that uses carpet bots that are automated using scripting. In order to use this, you'll need to make sure that you have carpet mod, carpet TIS editions, and it's also recommended to have an optimization mod such as lithium just so the cannon doesn't lag too badly. Once you have all the mods, all you need to do is join the world, pop your arrow into the aiming mechanism like so, and then you can start the cannon. It automatically spawns the bots. And once the cannon starts, you can try your luck at aiming. So you want to try and lead the players. However, I've designed it so that they will actually move around and change their angle of attack. So it's a bit tricky to predict where they're going to be. However, with enough practice, you can get used to the rhythm of the cannon and get an idea for where to aim in relation to the players. There we go, I finally got one. That was kind of embarrassing how long that took. Oh, I got that one instantly. Well then, you lose one, you win some. There we go, one more left. And I got it, finally! Got all four of them. So that was my third attempt at this, and it took me about 550 rounds to eliminate all four targets. That is about 140 rounds per target, which is actually pretty good given that in World War I, against biplanes flying at similar speeds and distances, anti-air emplacements would often expend thousands of rounds against each aircraft. And I'm not even that good at this. It would be insane to see what a skilled player could do with this. In fact, I hypothesized that a skilled PvP player who's mastered the technique could even outperform my scripted aimbot. Although I will admit that the aimbot is having a lot of trouble with higher firing angles and I'm not exactly sure why. So there is definitely some room for improvement. Also, a lot of you might be wondering, what does this mean for the Happy Ghast? Well, I've observed a strange phenomenon with this cannon where the Happy Ghast appears to rapidly despawn in a certain radius around the cannon whenever it's active. How peculiar. Anyway, this has been an amazing project, and I hope that together we've expanded our horizons for what is possible with Minecraft's base mechanics. As usual with these designs, you can find links to downloads in the description, and on the way there you can perhaps hit that subscribe button and let me know what kinds of tech you'd like to see next. Thank you all very much for watching, and I will see you next time.